Welcome to the course Literature of the Ancient Near East. I'm Dr. Justin Singleton. Please forgive any coughs or mess-ups in the recording of this lecture. Okay, in this second lecture, we're going to be setting some context for the works that you'll be reading, and therefore we'll be talking about the three-age system and the Longue Durée. Basically, in this lecture, we're going to discuss the concept of the longue durée, which is the French for the long duration, stemming from the Annals or Braudelian school of thought when discussing historiography. In this section, we'll talk about the topography of the Near East as well as the climate. Finally, we'll discuss the three-age system, namely the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. Now, literature is a reflection of society. When one reads the literature of any society, one is able to peer through a lens and view that society, even if one has never known that particular community. At the same time, literature can shape a society. And as such, it's no wonder why censorship is installed within dictatorships, where the shaping of a society is managed in a particular way. Because of the very nature of literature as a social reproductive strategy, that is, the reproducing of societal norms to the next generation, it can be understood as a type of propaganda to the readers. And since the publishing of literature throughout history very often falls to the elite, the published literature acts as a dissemination of approved beliefs about the world. Now, this is not meant to be stated in a negative light. Instead, it's a simple matter of fact that all literature is biased and written so that the reader will walk away from the work a changed person. Since the reader must become aware of these biases, the reader should therefore have a better understanding of who the writer is. And within ancient literature, that author is separated from modern readers by both time and space. Understanding the ancient author's intent, what that writer intended the audience to take away from the work, means first understanding the broader society in which that author lived and wrote. Therefore, the reader of ancient literature must first study that ancient society. The first step in studying any ancient society is attempting to understand the broader picture of history, to understand the forest and then the individual trees. Because of this, the student of ancient literature must grasp both the differing levels of historiographical elements and the sequenced material culture. That is, to understand the Braudelian approach to historiography, commonly known by its first level, la longue durée, and also to understand the three-age system. The beginning of any study of the history of a region must start with an understanding of the broader truths that help the student visually comprehend what's happening as history unfolds. In order to do this, two elements are important: understanding the basic topography of the region and understanding the climate. Within the Braudelian understanding, these represent a peek into la longue durée, the long duration, also known as geographical time. And since the scope of the work is limited, specifically a peek into that of the Near East. To speak of the topography of a region is to speak of the geographical layout, including mountains, plains, and water such as lakes, rivers, and seas. These not only supply resources to their inhabitants, but also create boundaries between groups, sometimes leading to linguistic and material differences. One aspect of these differing topographical realities stems from the way the Earth works, specifically geology. Through geological principles, the Near East contains 9 major geological profiles, including granite, Nubian sandstone, hard limestone, soft limestone, chalk and chert, basalt, red sand, dune sand, and alluvium. When compared to how humanity may use these resources, their importance becomes evident. For example, granite is prominent in the Nile Basin and was used for vases, statues, stelae, buildings, and sarcophagi from quite early on in Egyptian history. Hard limestone is found on both sides of the Jordan River and was used as a building material, but could also be cut into to create cisterns to keep and store water during dry seasons. As this stone decays, it becomes red soil, which is excellent for agriculture. Alluvium deposits exist along rivers and shorelines. This conglomeration of sediments is also extremely fertile and used to grow crops. The topographical layout of the land was what drew people to those areas, often in search of food or shelter. Key locales that drew many were mountains. Mountains supply wood from their forests, stone and metals from within them, meat from the animals that hide there, but mountains also tend to separate, isolate, insulate, interrupt, hide, and limit. These boundaries are difficult to cross and form natural fortifications by either separating groups or by acting as obstacles to climb over. By way of example, the Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon mountains that isolate the Phoenician homeland insulated the cities of Tyre and Sidon from the almost global cataclysm that occurred around 1200 BC, sometimes referred to as the Great Migration. At that time, during the Bronze and Iron Age transition, destructions are seen from the Black Sea to Egypt, and the major Mediterranean trade network founded by the Mycenaeans collapsed, causing the abandonment of many sites that happened to survive the multiple conquests. Because of the insular nature of the Phoenician coast and because of the lumber that those mountains provided, Tyre would build ships and replace the lost trade networks, bringing wealth to the Phoenician coastal cities that would last until the Roman era. Other mountain ranges include the Zagros and Elburz mountains that separate the Iranian plateau from the Fertile Crescent. Again, the natural boundaries of mountains retain limited access to either side. From ancient times until the Ottoman Empire, the Zagros acted as a separation between east and west, but they also represent at least one of the starting points of early pastoralism, and thus emerge as one of the first influencers of world relations. The Pontus, Taurus, Aegean blocks, and Armenian mountains separated Anatolia from the rest of the world, allowing for the building of an empire in both location and emporia, including tin, a metal needed in the bronze industry, to be traded with the rest of the Near East. Later in history, tin was discovered in the Sinai Mountains, and the Sinai and Hejaz Mountains acted as wind barriers, at times protecting Egypt and Nubia from the sands of Arabia. In fact, the climatic effect mountains have on much of the Near East is extremely important. Rivers and lakes find as their sources rain and snow melt that originates from these mountains, sometimes providing too much, which can either be agriculturally devastating or beneficial. Generally speaking, mountain ranges found above 30 degrees north, such as the Pontic, Taurus, and the western part of the Elburz Mountains, receive precipitation from Mediterranean winter cyclones, often falling as snow, whereas those mountain ranges found below 30 degrees north, such as the Hejaz and the Sinai, are less frequently penetrated by Mediterranean storms, meaning less precipitation. Between these mountain ranges, and sometimes even within the mountain ranges, are the plains and plateaus, somewhat flat areas of land that are often used as arable farmland, pastures, areas to travel, sites to build villages, and so forth. As population density correlates to agriculture, the alluvial plains attract urban settlements, feeding, connecting, and empowering their inhabitants. And high plateaus add to this the characteristic of protection. Between the Pontic and Taurus Mountains is the Anatolian Plateau, which receives about 400 millimeters of rain or snow on average, though this differs from year to year. This region moved from a simple agrarian society in the early Bronze Age to a high-functioning society with imperial ambitions by the late Bronze Age, all based on the growth of trade and exchange. Outside of the mountains and hills, when the plains could be properly irrigated by nature or man-made canals, lakes, swamps, and marshes could be created. The land would then be hydrated for crops or for grazing pastures. Thus, settlements in and around the Nile, Jordan, Tigris, and Euphrates rivers were established. Similar to Anatolia, the settlements and cities on the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers participated in short-distance trade with agricultural areas and nearby towns, establishing roads and networks that eventually led to foreign exchange and imperial ambitions. Rainfall within the fertile floodplains of these two rivers is not needed, as the rivers themselves supply hydration to the land, though this also means a swift change to a desert climate as one moves away from the rivers. The floodplains of Egypt also supply life-giving water by river. But whereas flooding in Mesopotamia could be destructive, flooding in Egypt was necessary. In fact, reduced flood discharge from the Nile during the Bronze Age is associated with catastrophe and the collapse of the centralized government. The Jordan Valley and Canaan also became an oasis and region where settlements were established. As noted before, water gives life. Rivers such as the Tigris and Euphrates, Jordan and Nile became hotspots for thriving civilizations. But major rivers were not the only sources of water. Small tributaries, streams, and smaller rivers funneling water down from the mountains were also fertile locations where settlers found a home. Additionally, river deltas, where rivers spill out into the seas or lakes, are especially fertile areas. These triangular-shaped landforms are created when sediments carried by the flowing water reach the still water, spreading alluvium, which ultimately builds up. Thus, the deposited alluvium causes the running water to find a path of least resistance, spreading the water out farther and in different directions. Many different species of both plant and animal life can be found in river deltas, making them the perfect place to establish a village. Some key deltas are the Nile Delta and the Tigris and Euphrates Delta. The latter offers an example of how deltas can push sediments into the sea, ultimately pushing the coastline farther away. In the Ubaid period, marshlands were located 200 kilometers farther north than they are today. In fact, settlements in what could now be considered central Iraq show evidence of marshland exploitation, including fishing net weights, reed harvesting by clay sickles, fish and pig bones, mollusks, and more. Villages once dependent upon these marshland resources wane in importance as the delta is pushed farther south, becoming dependent upon man-made irrigation instead. Other villages and towns are established upon the new delta, but these too are forced out over time. Conversely, the Nile Delta has changed little over the past 5,000 years when compared to Mesopotamia. Fresh and saltwater bodies of water also play key roles throughout history. Shorelines, just as rivers, have been used as travel networks since at least the Neolithic. These have also supplied food sources such as fish and shellfish, and even the occasional sea mammals such as whales or dolphins. The major seas include, of course, the Mediterranean, but also the Black, Caspian, and Red Seas, and the Persian Gulf. though, as noted before, the Persian Gulf has changed positions over the years. Smaller bodies of water, such as large lakes or seas, such as the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, also offer life-giving water, though with the Dead Sea this is not particularly true, except for the delta marshes. Other bodies of water include the multiple lakes, oases, and swamps that could be found along tributaries, rivers, near the seas, or in the mountains. Now, because of the geography of the Middle East, three main ecological zones appear, including the Mediterranean, steppe, and desert zones. These zones are related to food systems, specifically how well the land can supply the food needed to survive. The Mediterranean zone, what could be called the zone of possibility, has long, dry summers and short, cool, wet winters. These zones of possibility are such because the climate is beneficial to floral growth, which attracts fauna and ultimately gave way to domesticated flora and fauna, plants and animals. The Mediterranean zones on the coastlines and along rivers sometimes very rapidly change into arid desert climates or mountainous regions. Of note, there are sometimes transitional zones in certain areas along the edges of the Mediterranean zone, and these are what can be referred to as degraded Mediterranean zones. These are areas with Mediterranean climate, but the degradation of the soil, sometimes due to erosion, has caused it to be less fertile. The steppes are areas where there's a rather thin food system. These can be thought of as the marginal zones. This is not to say that life is absent, simply that there's not much of an opportunity for growth. As the Mediterranean zone, the steppes can have two different classifications. They can be classified as semi-arid and arid. Neither of these regions are likely to supply crops consistently, but they make excellent pasture land for nomadic and semi-nomadic groups. These arid steppes are sometimes referred to in the biblical text as the wilderness, not the entirely empty sands of the desert, but the regions of marginal growth. Finally, what many think of when they hear the phrase Middle East are the desert zones, or the zones of impossibility. Within deserts, there's basically no food system. That is, very little possibility of growth. Deserts are very dry and water scarce, making both the growing of crops and animal husbandry an impossibility. Like mountains, deserts are extremely dangerous to cross. Thus, deserts acted as barriers between groups. At times, winds blown across deserts continue on into fertile regions, bringing strong heat and sand particles that are often associated with the destruction of crops. In biblical terminology, these winds are described as east winds, that is, winds from the Syro-Arabian desert. Usually, Egypt and Canaan are protected from these east winds by the presence of the Hejaz and Judean mountains, but at times the winds prevail. Ultimately, these three ecological zones in the Near East form a crescent shape on the map, which is often referred to as the Fertile Crescent. On a large scale, the Fertile Crescent is a broad area of possibility. This is the region where crops grow, animals breed, sometimes resulting in food surplus. A food surplus means that individuals now have time to focus on work other than food-related activities. Thus, craft specializations such as metallurgy, pottery, and even warfare begin to form. Craft specializations eventually lead to the development of societies where groups of people work together to survive. Some focused on food-related occupations, others on building, and still others on leading, inventing, and so forth. In the end, cultural and political domination flows out of the river valley cultures. In addition to understanding the elements of geographical time, and in fact perhaps thought of as another aspect of geographical time, involves resources, and that is the three-age system, the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age separations, commonly referred to as the three-age system. This system was first published in 1836 and has been used with variations ever since, though not in every region of the world. Each of these ages has been divided into their respective subcategories, which are divided further still. The Stone Age is often divided into the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, and finally the Neolithic, or New Stone Age. And sometimes this is followed by the Chalcolithic, or the Copper Stone Age. The Bronze Age is divided into early, middle, and late. For example, Middle Bronze Age. And each of these are then subdivided by giving them a number. For example, Early Bronze Age 3. Of note, in the Levant, Middle Bronze Age 1 is not typically used any longer, or it's been referred to as the Intermediate Bronze Age. What I do, the system that I follow, is we merge Middle Bronze 1 into the Early Bronze Age to form Early Bronze Age 4. The Iron Age in the Levant is divided into Iron Age 1, 2, and 3 rather than early, middle, and late. Iron 3 is sometimes not used, instead moving into the historical periods of the Babylonian and Persian empires. Since numbers are used in place of early, middle, and late, the third category uses letters. For example, Iron Age 2B. As is evident by the inconsistency in the nomenclatures of the subdivisions, much of this system is still highly debated. Many scholars opting for, at a minimum, differing date ranges, but also some use different terminology altogether. Additionally, it should be pointed out that although this system is used all over the world, the age of one region may or may not correspond to other regions. For example, when the Levant was beginning its Iron Age, Italy was only just beginning its Late Bronze Age. It should also be pointed out that although the types of resources used are within the names of these ages, the use of these resources do not necessarily correspond to the starting point of each. Iron was used in Mesopotamia and Egypt quite a while before the Iron Age began, though merely in small quantities. Also, bronze was not consistently utilized in the Levant until well into the Bronze Age. Finally, the question of Near Eastern dating is problematic, as many of the dates are relative to other dates. Very few absolute dates have been determined in the ancient Near East. For example, the recording... apparently I was supposed to click that before. This is an example of relative dating. Since it didn't pop up in time, let me just explain. Sorry about that. So you see we have a horseshoe and a glass bottle. Since they're both found in stratum B, we can date one based on the other. We can say, well, I don't know when this glass bottle was made, because glass bottles are still made today, right? Well, the horseshoe we know is dated to blah, blah, blah because of whatever reasons. Therefore, since the glass bottle is found in the same stratum as the horseshoe, then we can say that these can be dated together. So it's all relative to other objects. Okay, now let me start that over again. Forgive me. Very few absolute dates have been determined in the ancient Near East. For example, the recording of a solar eclipse that has been mathematically calculated to have occurred on June 15th, 763 BC. From that absolute date, relative dating techniques are then utilized both forward and backward to determine points on a timeline when events most likely occurred. Unfortunately, sometimes even these absolute dates are not absolute. In 1912, A scholar believed that he had found astronomical records of both the appearance of Venus in the night sky, an event. Uh, okay, I'm not going to restart this, so you're going to have to just bear with me. I just finished creating this, and apparently I didn't have all of my little marks in my notes. So, anyway, in 1912, a scholar thought that he had found, he did find, astronomical records of both the appearance and disappearance of Venus in the night sky. And that event mathematically fits multiple points in the Assyrian chronology. Because these multiple points exist, Assyrian dates now fall into three potentialities, referred to as the long, middle, and short chronologies. But these are still highly debated. Most texts, like textbooks and whatnot that you're going to be reading today, simply refer to dates given in the middle chronology and just avoid the debate altogether. But this gives you an example of an absolute date and how relative dating is formed from that. Okay, although the Stone Age begins with the Paleolithic, with a scientific date of around 1.4 million years ago, for the purpose of this study, the starting point is that of the Neolithic, very often associated with the move from hunting and gathering to that of farming. Although not sudden, this radical change in subsistence patterns is sometimes referred to as the Neolithic Revolution, as it begins several innovative phases in history. In the Near East, the Neolithic is broken down into pre-pottery and pottery Neolithic, with the scientific dates for pre-pottery Neolithic A at around 8000 BC. Pre-pottery Neolithic B in the southern Levant, often associated with Jericho, has a date of around 7000 BC. In Upper Mesopotamia, this begins a transitional period into an initial pottery Neolithic. In the northern Levant, this is called simply Early Pottery Neolithic, and in Anatolia, simply Pottery Neolithic. In the biblical chronology, all of this, of course, would be post-flood. With the rise of agriculture came other advancements, including the need to be closer to one's crops and herds in order to protect them. Thus, in the Neolithic is seen the development of households, base camps, and villages. Additionally, uses for the agricultural resources led to the development of textiles, often from wool and flax. A third advancement also began in the Neolithic, one that allowed for the preservation of these agricultural resources, which, as the nomenclature of these periods describes, is the beginning of pottery. Between the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age is the Chalcolithic, also known as the Copper Age or Neolithic. Chalco stemming from the Greek word for copper, and Neo stemming from the Latin word of the same. It's here that urban settlements develop further, one scholar even calling these settlements the first cities. The Chalcolithic shifts from the Halaf culture of the Neolithic to the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia and the Levant. One of the many small cultures developing in the Neolithic Chalcolithic period, and the Chalcolithic eventually gives way to the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age extends from around 3300 BC to around 1200 BC, and as noted before, is split into three periods: early, middle, and late. Each of these periods is then split into their own respective subperiods. The Early Bronze Age is split into Early Bronze 1, 2, 3, and 4, though this last period has been highly controversial. The following period, Middle Bronze, is also cut into chunks, but now everything gets all wonky. In the Levant, at least according to some chronologies, Middle Bronze is divided into Middle Bronze 2, A through C. Middle Bronze 1 is now obsolete as that period has been merged into Early Bronze Age in the form of Early Bronze 4, though some still use Middle Bronze 1. So it gets really confusing when you're reading textbooks because you don't know which system you're following. So forgive me, but you'll have to hang in there and try to figure it out. Another name for The period between Early Bronze and Middle Bronze, specifically Early Bronze Age 4, some people just call it the Intermediate Bronze Age. And you'll find that a lot in your readings. The history of the Levant is that of growth, collapse, and growth. The ups and downs and ups and downs. The early Bronze Age is a perfect example of the up aspects, followed by the down at the end. This rise and fall of social complexity in Palestine is seen at the very beginning of the early Bronze Age, a change from one culture in the Chalcolithic to a completely different culture in early Bronze 1, though the Levant is still a very poor place filled with small, unwalled villages and many farmsteads. EB2 brought a small bit of change as the villages become walled, a move toward urbanism, though there were still farmsteads. EB3 stood as a time of richness. Very few but large walled cities could be found, along with a few farmsteads, the people having gathered together for both ease of life and for protection. At this point in the Bronze Age, the Levant is bubbling over with life. There's some destructive behavior, but these are most likely internal conflicts rather than outside invaders. Now, note, this is not the time of the patriarchs. Instead, this is the Levant before Abraham. EB4 brings a collapse. The large walled cities are no longer in use. In their place, many small unwalled villages appear, and once again, many farmsteads. EB4 was a time not of richness, but of poverty. It's here that Abraham enters Canaan. Middle Bronze 2A is a time of cosmopolitan revival. The decline of EB4 enters MB2A with expansion. There are now over 400 sites in Canaan. Many walled cities are found, but they fight against one another. About 65% of the inhabitants of Canaan now, once again, live in walled cities. The revival coincides with the Semitic Amorite dynasties in the east, and the second half of the revival in Middle Bronze II coincides with the Hyksos in Egypt, these two great empires both having Semitic roots. During MB2A, Canaan distinguishes itself in material culture from EB4 in its settlement patterns, urbanization, architecture, metallurgy, pottery, and even burial customs. There appears to have been a wave of northern coastal settlements that extended to other northern valleys, including large fortified cities, forts, and rural sedentary settlements. Concerning pottery, the new fast wheel brought new shapes. Characteristic are the globular jars jugs, carinated thin bowls, flat large bowls, pyriform juglets, and large dipper juglets. Red burnished ware appears on many of the small vessels. In metals, bronze now replaced copper, and the Middle Bronze II B through C developed from the MB2A types. The duckbill axe, which you see there on your screen, disappeared, and a smaller and the narrower chisel-shaped axe prevailed. Daggers had a multi-ridged blade, and spearheads were elongated. Evidence for an immigration from the north is seen in the absence of any gradual changes between EB4 and MB2A. Now, as cultures collide, concepts spread and eventually became what we now call Middle Bronze II societies. In Middle Bronze II BC, developed miniature artifacts of figure, jewelry, and more are found, and the few written documents are in cuneiform Akkadian. The Late Bronze Age in Canaan existed in the shadow of Egyptian domination. Population and density of settlement declined. The fringe areas were left, and some important sites are now left empty. Just as the greatness of EB3 met the demise of EB4, so the greatness of Middle Bronze II BC met the demise of the Late Bronze Age. city against city, and outside Habiru brought destruction throughout the land. The Late Bronze Age, like EB4, contained a lack of fortifications. At most, none have been found, though some continued in use from the Middle Bronze defenses. Hatzor is one of those sites with a double casement wall being continually rebuilt throughout the Late Bronze Age. Town planning of Canaanite cities is almost unknown, as only limited areas have been excavated. At Hatzor and Megiddo, Middle Bronze plans continued. The Megiddo Palace shows a gradual development, and several large buildings are defined as local patrician houses. Late Bronze temples provide data on some aspects of Canaanite religion. Some were erected during the previous age, and although some underwent severe changes, others basically remain the same. International trade was an important part of the Late Bronze Age, including Cypriot, Mycenaean, Syrian, and Egyptian pottery. And this extended from the Middle Bronze Age, as there is no distinct break in material culture between the two periods. Pottery included bichrome ware, Cypriot ware, Mycenaean ware, and more. And Cyprus was the main source of copper during this time. Just as EB4 was the end of greatness of times before, so Late Bronze was the end of the greatness of times gone by. But this was not limited to Canaan. The known world itself seems to have been turned upside down by the time of the Great Migration that introduced the Iron Age. The dawn of the Iron Age ended the city-state period of multi-ethnic Canaanite culture and introduced the ethno-political regional structure of the Israelites, Phoenicians, Sea Peoples, and the remaining indigenous Canaanites. Across the Jordan, there were Israelites, Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, and Arameans. With the founding of the different Philistine cities along the coastal plains comes Philistine bichrome pottery, which was developed from Mycenaean ware. The Philistine ware also borrowing from local Canaanite traditions, mainly in use of red and black ink. Later, in the Iron Age, a major shift is made from small kingdoms to the advancement of empires, what some call the Age of Empires. It was a game I used to play on a computer, including the Assyrians and Babylonians, and then the Persians, Greeks, Romans, and so forth. Well, this has been the entirety of the Ancient Near East squeezed into one lecture. So although rather meaty, I hope you still got something out of it. And forgive me for pausing so often. If it felt choppy, it's because I kept pausing it to cough. Well, as always, feel free to reach out with any comments or questions.